Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone had a lovely long weekend. We'll just wait for another moment or two in a minute for people to join the room. Thank you all, as always, for coming in and listening to our webinars. Really appreciate it. Today, I've got some very good, exciting content coming up. Yeah, just one more minute and then we'll start. We'll get it started. As always, there will be questions available. There'll be time available for questions at the end of the webinar. So, feel free to type out your questions as well on this webinar portal, and we'll get to answer them towards the end. Great. So first of all, a warm welcome to everybody. So those of you who are this first time listening to this webinar, welcome. And for those of you loyal listeners, thank you for coming in again. It's good to see you. I see some familiar names already. So today's topic, very interesting actually. It's about love, money, wills, and trusts, protecting your family and businesses with a trust.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what's exciting as well is that I'll be joined here by my colleague who is a solicitor, Netsai, and who, again, we will show you and will demonstrate to you why trusts, although it just seems like such a topic that's for the wealthy and the rich, but it's not. It's actually for everybody. So just a quick recap about Fusion. We are a multidisciplinary professional services firm encompassing the full range of professional advice, varying from tax, from legal, financial advice, and accountancy advice. Now, joining us today is myself. My name is Chenji. I am the head of financial services here at Fusion, and also Netsai, who is the solicitor at Fusion Law. And as always, as a thank you for joining our webinar, we would like to offer you a complimentary legal and financial consultation. So, anytime afterwards, just reach out to us and we'll be able to see if we can help you and add value to your both legal and financial lives. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic on to Netsai, who is going to actually give us a good intro to trust, because I think most people, they just hear trust on the media, on TV, on everything. But tell us, what types of trusts are there?
That is true, Chenji. Thank you for the introduction. So the concept of trust often makes people think of Downton Abbey and the old type of trusts which have passed down for years and years and generations. However, trusts are, when you drill down into it, quite a simple concept. There are obviously quite a few different types of trusts, some more complicated than others. So today, obviously, we can't cover everything, but what we will try and do is talk about the main trusts, such as the Bear Trust, the Life Interest Trust, and a Discretionary Trust. So the Bear Trust, and it's obviously easy to remember because you could just think of a bear, but it's one of the simplest forms of trust, really. It's one of those which is perhaps simple in its form, simple in its taxation. It's often used by grandparents, for example, to reduce their estate. If a grandparent is in generally good health, they might want to give cash or assets over to their grandchildren during their lifetime, which effectively reduces their estate, but at the same time also gifts to their beloved grandchildren. Well, with the fear of possibly passing on cash to a 17-year-old who's going to spend it on a PS5, grandparents can actually use a Bear Trust to put the money in trust to be managed by trustees who will then oversee the money, and any type of income generated from that trust can, for example, be advanced to the children for example, their education, maintenance, or healthcare. It's one of the most tax efficient ways of reducing one's estate, particularly if the pet grandparents go on to survive 7 years, then they're considered as making a pet, which then moves outside of the estate for IHT entirely. Once the child is 18 years old, they do, however, become fully entitled to the capital and income. However, you can make provisions as to how that will be advanced at that time. So, for example, a lot of people might be saving the money for the grandchildren to then benefit and use it for university fees. As we know, university loans are now increasing due to the interest rates. So this is one of the very good ways of putting money aside for someone's education and their general maintenance as they're young. The other trust that you might have heard of is a life interest trust. This is often contained within wills, and it's one of the best ways of managing estates that might, for example, involve blended families. As we know, blended families are very common. I believe I read an article that said, a Guardian article in 2021, which mentioned that 1 in 3 families will be blended families by 2024. So it's actually quite common. What people tend to have concerns about is, for example, if they have children from a previous marriage, they would want those children to benefit from naturally their hard-earned cash or assets that they've brought into the new marriage. And likewise, they might want to just protect that after they've passed away. So it's a form of asset protection, but it also is another tax efficient form or way of actually passing down assets whilst preserving your IHT allowances. So you can preserve your nil rate band, your spouse's nil rate band, potentially the residential nil rate band and transferable residential nil rate band as well, to be benefited for your children, to benefit once the second spouse has passed away. And the last trust, which I'm sure we've all heard of, is the discretionary trust. And it is all in the name. A discretionary trust allows your trustees to exercise their discretion. Of course, you yourself will want to perhaps give them some directions as to what your wishes are. So usually you would draft a letter of wishes, which would specify how you want your beneficiaries to benefit and the provisions that your trustees should take into consideration. It's used for various amount of reasons. So, for example, you can have children who might not be very good with money and you just want the trustees to look over their spending. You might also want to protect the assets from divorce, bankruptcy, debt, for example, and just to ensure that the beneficiaries who benefit later on, for example, for the capital, actually have something to benefit from. So what might be a common way of using this trust is you might be able to, in your letter of wishes, advance the income to your spouse, for example, and the capital then remains in the trust until your spouse has passed away, and then your children will benefit from the capital. It's also very flexible in allowing you to benefit different beneficiaries in different ways, unlike the bare trusts. However, taxation for these types of trusts can be really, really complicated. So it's always better to speak to someone who is knowledgeable in this area and can give you really good specific advice, which Chenji and I can do. So you can always speak to us about it. And it will be tailored to your circumstances. There are other things that you can do with a discretionary trust, So you can place a loan within a discretionary trust. You can gift to a discretionary trust, but again, Chenji will touch on these a bit later. And I hope that's been useful in giving you a brief synopsis of the different types of trust that there are, and hopefully it's not too much information.
No, I think we can always benefit from more information.
Yeah,
but I think it's a great intro to what trusts are, different types of trusts. And actually, I think a lot of you now want to know how can you actually benefit from using trust. But just before that, can I just ask a quick question? Let's say, so are those trusts you can use during your lifetime, or are those trusts that you set up after you pass on?
So bare trusts and discretionary trusts can be set up in your lifetime and also within your will. So that's the beauty of both of those types of trusts. Life interest trusts are often set up within a will and become effective on death, and that's usually how they operate. The benefit of all of those trusts is effectively you are having a say from beyond the grave, so to speak. Even though you may not have entire control over everything, you can do your very best to make sure that your beneficiaries benefit in the way that you intend. And after all, it is your estate, so it makes sense that you would want to make the best provisions for everyone, but also make sure that your hard-earned money doesn't go to waste.
Stays in the family.
Yeah.
Very well done. So now we want to now talk about how you can actually use a trust. And before that, I just want to also just give some, provide some background on what are the roles within a trust, because I think there's different roles that that people each have within the trust, right? And just want to clarify what they mean. So on the overall basis, there's a few more people involved, but on a main general simple trust, there's three roles involved, right? So you have the settlor, who are the people who are essentially donating assets. It could be money, it could be property, it could be investments into the trust, right? And then you have the trustees, who are the people actually in control of the trust's assets. So it can be one trustee, it can be multiple trustees, and you can make decisions either on a jointly basis or perhaps on an individual basis, depending on circumstances. And then finally, there are beneficiaries. Who would you like this trust to benefit from? Now, what's very interesting is that you can specify either individuals who can benefit, right? Or you can just say, I want a class of beneficiaries. Now, what a class of beneficiaries means is it might actually be people that haven't even been born yet. Exactly. So if you say, for example, I want my beneficiaries to be my children and my current children and future children, that means this is a class of beneficiaries. So you may not have a child that's currently born yet, but in the future, if you do have an additional child joining, this trust will be able to benefit them. And if your children don't have children, that would benefit them as well. Now, am I correct to say that as the settlor, you cannot benefit from the trust?
There are quite complicated rules, as you know, Chenji, around gifts with reservation of benefit. That's the technical term. So the way HMRC tend to view any types of gifts is that if you give away something, you have to be seen to give it away entirely. If you reserve a benefit or benefit from that asset, and the rules can be really, really strict, insofar as I remember examples of a painting hanging that you've given away to someone, but it might still hang in your wall, so you still have enjoyment of it. So effectively, it's still in your estate. So one thing we wouldn't usually recommend is settlor interested trusts, although they do exist. The taxation can be very, very complex, and for that reason, it's quite good for people to use trusts where they, for example, don't always want to benefit. There are ways you can benefit. I believe loan trusts, for example, are one way you might still get benefit from a discretionary trust set up within within a discretionary trust. However, again, those are things that you would need to seek advice on.
Fantastic. But am I correct in assuming that the settlors can be the trustees? So they cannot benefit from it, but they can be the trustees?
That's correct. Sometimes people still want to oversee the assets and obviously have a level of control. And so for that reason, they would need to consider whether or not them being a trustee is in their best interest to help manage the trust.
Fantastic. So a lot of we got a lot of questions actually about what type of assets to hold in a discretionary trust. And I think the most common type people want to put in is actually properties, right? And which is then followed by, okay, should I have cash in the trust as well? And then, furthermore, if you want to, again, keep in place with inflation, you need to also put some investments into a trust. But again, all these come with quite sophisticated tax implications, right? Because trusts have the highest rate of taxation, right? So we're talking about income tax, right? For any interest, for example, on cash or rental income from properties, 45%, right? Dividends is also taxed at the highest level, 38.1%. And capital gains wise, it is taxed at 20%. So, just be careful if you do put cash in the trust, right? There are reporting requirements, because if you are getting interest from the trust, right, that is considered an income. Same with property, especially if it is a rental property, any rental income that comes in will be taxed on your highest income tax rates. And with investments, right, you have to be careful, because again, we don't want to trigger very high amounts of dividend rates on a trust, as well as capital gains rates. But I'm going to just quickly talk to you about what's a smart investment to hold in a discretionary trust. It doesn't trigger these high potential tax liabilities. Now, these type of investments that are very trust friendly are called investment bonds, and these are essentially a insurance contract. Now, the specific feature which makes them beneficial to be held in a trust is because they are considered a tax deferred investment. It means that whilst you're able to take some money out from the investment bond, you are not triggering an immediate tax obligation. You're only triggering that obligation once something called a chargeable event has happened. And there's various sort of rules about what a chargeable event can be. So that means as long as you don't trigger this chargeable event, not only is there no tax to pay, there is also no tax reporting requirements. Because if you do hold a trust, for example, right, you need to have it, potentially hire an accountant and a tax advisor to file the tax returns. But if you hold an investment bond and don't trigger a chargeable event and still take some money out every year, right, you don't even have to report it to the HMRC. Now, with these investment bonds, there's also differentiating between onshore and offshore. They might sound very fancy, but all it means is that if it's an onshore investment bond, the investment itself pays 20% tax, which is put forward as a credit. Offshore just means it's held in a tax-free jurisdiction and no tax is paid. But once you take the money out, once a chargeable event is triggered, you don't have any tax credits associated with it. Now, overall, the investment bond is the most efficient investment structure to be used within the trust. Now, next section, we're just going to talk a little bit about, what are some really good planning opportunities. And I think this section just really, it should be like a more interactive session with NetSide, because, we deal on a daily basis significantly with trusts, right? And I think today it's just about giving you guys some examples, some case studies on how trusts have benefited everyday people like you and I.
Yeah. So as Chenji mentioned, it's always good to put context to the use of trusts. And I think we have experienced various different types of trusts and reasons why people have, for example, put their assets in a trust. When it comes to discretionary trusts, they can be used, as we mentioned before, in order to protect assets from, for example, divorce. Using an example of a client that I've dealt with personally, the testator, well, this is obviously before she passed away, she purchased a house for her son in order for him to live in that property. Property was then in his sole name. He then married, and the married couple lived within that property. However, unfortunately, they divorced. And once they went through the divorce proceedings, unfortunately, the house became subject to those proceedings and he lost the property. So on purchasing a second property for him, she sought advice and then decided that the best way to go was for her to actually put the property within a discretionary trust. This would not only allow, for example, her son to live there for the duration of his life, because now he was on his second marriage and had children from that marriage as well. And so it would also provide provision for his new wife and his children and his child, to live within that property for their lifetime. And thereafter, the trust, once it dissolves, the property could be sold and passed on to other beneficiaries who included her other children and grandchildren and so forth. So it is a way of ring fencing the asset and protecting it from life events such as divorce. And of course, if the person were to fall into debt or creditors were to come for the asset, then it's not necessarily held in their sole name, which exposes the asset itself and, like as you said, the hard earned money that's been put forward by his mother. Have you got more examples that you've come across?
Well, frivolous children.
Yeah.
I think in my line of work, clients always ask me, right, what should I do? I mean, I've worked hard for my money, right? And the next generation feels quite detached to how I've made the money, and they've been spending it, right? And personally, I come from I'm an only child. I'm from China, and in my generation, right, we've all been victims of the one-child policy, and many of my sort of my circle, right, parents are relatively wealthy, and they just feel so detached of the money, and they know everything goes to them, they just become very, very frivolous, right? And what happens is that I've seen many times that the children just squander away the money, right? And as an example for clients, once the children reach 18 and they've had these invest junior ISAs to children's savings accounts, child trust funds saved up for them, we're talking about a couple £20,000, £30,000. Then what happens is when they turn 18, guess what they're doing with their money?
PS5s, PS6.
Well, buy a car, buy a fancy watch, buy a fancy car, go on a big holiday in Marbella, right? So, again, not the end of the world, but still, is it really money that you want that? Is the first point of contact going to be, am I speaking to a professional to see where I can purchase assets, such as, how can I buy a property that can grow, where I can grow my wealth? How can I get into investments where I can, keep in place with inflation? They will not do that, right? So, but within a trust, right, which is for the client, so the children has wasted some money away, but essentially from now on, any gifts that they're making, they're only gifting it to a trust, the discretionary trust, whereby they still act as the trustees. And in that letter of wishes, right, as I mentioned, it says you are able to use that money. You can take that money out, right, if you use it for education, if you use it for healthcare, if you use it for a deposit on the first time property purchase, right, it's more reasonable, right, but specifically prohibits money being used to buy a Lamborghini, like an exotic car, right, or like a big holiday home. So yeah, frivolous children. And of course, and more recently, I think what's been really happening, what's been on my mind, which is the third and very important part, bankruptcy and debt protection, right? Now, it used to be many years ago, the only type of debt you really took out was a mortgage, right? So to purchase your property that you lived in, right? Or perhaps a rental property. And then, more recently, last 20 years, 30 years, the rise of car loans. So people now, instead of saving up, £20,000 to purchase a Ford Fiesta, nowadays people just, again, use finance, right? So every month you're paying £300, £400. And if you can't afford it, you just go into default. Now, these days, you can even buy coffees with finance.
And right? I was quite shocked to hear that. Honestly, I think
Klarna, buy now, pay later. Like buy now, pay later has just been the name of the game in the recent years. And what's happened recently to a client is actually, and to be fair, they were not suffering from this, but what really got me thinking is, there are landlords, and many years ago they've had a bad tenant who didn't pay them rent for many years.
Yes.
Right, and obviously owed them money, and just a few months ago, they found out that that tenant got married.
Okay.
So now the solicitor has recommended them to go after the family, the newly formed family, because she may not have enough assets to cover the debt, right? And again, the court at the time has already given the judgment to again to repay all of the debt that they owe to the family. So now the person who they married is liable for this debt.
I guess that also encourages people to ask the right questions before you marry people, because these things are relevant when it comes to trust.
Absolutely. So, and now, and this is just, again, with a simple sort of a default on a rent. But now, again, if everything young people buy these days are based on finance, right? You can imagine that there is a generation of people there that hold nothing but debt. And by having money protected in trust, you protect them against these types of legacy debt. So, so this is the asset protection aspect of, how a trust might be helpful. Now, of course, people might have heard, like, how do we use trusts for inheritance tax mitigations, right? And again, there's multiple ways how you can do it, right? And, with this example here onto the right is just to show you as an overview, the types that you can take advantage of. So first type is called a loan trust. This is essentially where you take advantage of something called asset freezing, right? As I mentioned earlier, you can make a loan to a trust, right? Whereby that loan amount you can still take, at any point, but if you invest that money within the trust, right, it can be in various different types of assets. And if you do receive any growth from that trust, right, that growth element is outside of your estate immediately, right? So you essentially froze your initial loan, but any growth is outside of your estate. Now, the second type is a gift trust, whereby, again, you make an irrevocable gift to the trust. Now, that gift itself will be outside of your estate in 7 years, but any growth that you do receive from the trust will be immediately outside of your estate. And there's a third type, which is called a discounted gift trust, whereby essentially, right, this is a method where, there is a calculation to it depending on your age, on your health, right? And then essentially HMRC will give you a discount on the gift because you still retain a little bit of benefit by taking an income for the rest of your life. But you've gifted the other capital element into the trust, which then again happens that in 7 years' time, that partial gift will be for outside of your estate and any growth element being outside of your estate immediately. Now, the fourth type, which is actually quite interesting because this actually applies to a lot of people, who are business owners, right? Who are perhaps looking at selling a business. And, because for a gift trust, you are limited by gifting your nil rate band, your available nil rate band, which at the moment is £325,000 per person. But with business relief shares, right? So if you are a business owner, this means that potentially your shares that you own in your business. If you are a non-business, owner, you're able to purchase business relief qualifying shares, which are, for example, ARM market shares, which are, things such as EISs, for example. So you can place unlimited amount of shares into a business relief shares into a trust. Now that opens up some very interesting cases to, again, put essentially more than your nil rate band allowance, which is £325,000, into a trust. So again, there's various things you have to be careful about. There are still gifting rules. There are still 7-year rules as well. So again, speak to a professional if you want to learn more about how to take advantage via this way.
And Confusion help with all of that in terms of setting up these trusts and obviously speaking to individuals and finding out whether or not it's suitable for them.
Well, that's you're the expert, right? So,
well, I think we've got varying skills with Infusion. So I think if you also need assistance with the accountancy side of things, we can assist with that all in-house, as well as the returns as well.
Great, fantastic. So, with that, we conclude our content for this. Hopefully a very sort of quick overview of how trust can help potentially your family, your business, right? I'm sure that I've seen a couple of questions already in the chat. So, but please let us know if you have any questions and just type them either on chat or the question and answer. Now, just going through the list, first of all, we have Casio Caceres question. We can only put in trust asset which is not tied, like mortgage.
Mortgages are always problematic, aren't they? Because in the first instance, you always need permission from the lender if you are, for example, to put any assets, particularly with a mortgage, into a trust. And usually the answer is no. You usually have to discharge the mortgage in the first place. But I believe there are also really big tax consequences to trying to do something like that. Could you explain, for example, if someone wanted to put a buy-to-let, for example, within a trust?
Well, I think, there's obviously various tax implications, right? But also just remember, right, if you put anything into a trust, the trust has legal ownership, right? Now that means instead of you as an individual dealing with the bank who provides you with a mortgage, now it's with a trust, right? And know that also trusts, I believe, cannot give, guarantees. Depending on the trust and depending on what the structure is, it may not be able to give guarantees. Now that means the bank will not give you a mortgage if it cannot offer a guarantee, right? Because it will always want a first charge on the property. So again, there's various intricacies, right? And depending on personal circumstances, there are different solutions, but you should explore this question with a professional, right? So, but as a rule, just know that, right? You could potentially put assets which is tied to like a loan, but you have to but the trust structure needs to be structured in the right way, and you have to source the right mortgage provider as well.
Correct. Yeah.
Great. Bill Nelson, there is conflicting advice as to whether probate is required if a trust is in place.
So I have quite a lot of experience with probate, and I would agree with you. I think that unfortunately, sometimes it really depends on the asset holder. So, for example, if you do have investment assets that happen to be within the trust, and let's use Charles Stanley as an example, if they insist on probate, then that is part and parcel of what their requirement is. And as you may already know, usually transferring property, particularly if someone has passed away, depending on how it's held, then probate is usually required for that. But unfortunately, I don't have a simple or straightforward answer, because it usually comes down to the process itself and once you're going through probate and the particular type of trust that you have.
Again, they never make it easy to understand, right?
No. Sometimes they're confused as well. So I think in terms of private client work, it can be a minefield sometimes, because you have to find your way through the answers. But again, it always depends on the individual's basis and the asset itself. So it might be personal to circumstances.
Great, perfect. So next question comes from Raj Patel. Can shares in a limited company holding rented properties subject to mortgage be gifted to a trust? Well, of course, you can look at gifting any types of things to the trust, but there might be different tax implications, right? And as an example, if it's just a property company, right, it's considered an investment company, so it's not considered a trading company, and you wouldn't be able to qualify for the business property relief in this case. So you're only limited to giving 225,000 each person into the trust, plus the gift exemption amount, so £3,000 per year, right? So the answer is, well, yes, you could look at gifting shares, right? But if you don't qualify for business relief, you're limited to the nil rate, your available nil rate band.
And how far back do we have to look, really? Is it 14 years as opposed to just 7 years?
Yeah, so this is the complicated rule, right? Which, Nessa, as you know, with discretionary trust, I mean, most people know about, 7-year rule for gifting assets, right? You have to live for 7 years before that gift falls outside of your estate. But with discretionary trusts, there is what's called a look back period, whereby you look back 14 years before the gift was made and see if there's any other, chargeable lifetime transfers. Right now, again, we can write a whole book about chargeable lifetime transfers, but if you have any, if you want to explore, learn more about what it actually is, please get in touch with us. That's how I'm sure you'll be able to help digest this. So Cassia, follow-up question, is there a way we can put the capital element of a property but not the rental income?
I think we have to shy away from advice here, but what would you normally, what's the overview that you would suggest to someone in that position?
Well, I think we're talking about a multi-layered structure,
exactly.
Right? Because again, if we're talking about capital income, we're then talking about, a limited company holding ABC shares, right? So again, it can be explored, but that's absolutely depending on your personal circumstances, exactly. What kind of company you already have, what's the goal of putting into a trust? Just again, it completely depends. So we have a tax department as well. I think that's also a tax question. So please let us know if you want to explore more about your personal circumstance. Next question, eBay Ubani. Do you do estate planning for portfolio landlords with multiple properties?
I believe, estate planning is exactly what we've discussed today. So lifetime planning, estate planning, they're all pretty much used interchangeably. So by all means, contact us if you would like to plan your estate now during your lifetime, to find out the most efficient way to manage your estate during your life and after death. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's definitely what we do here.
Yeah, and we have an award-winning tax advisory business, that deals extensively with property landlords. And what happens usually with property is because it is what's good about property. It's bricks and mortar. You can touch it, you can feel it.
Yes.
But what's bad about property? You can feel it, so they can HMRC.
Exactly.
So you should to plan for estate planning for property holders, right? It definitely involves a multidisciplinary approach, because the tax advisor has to again structure it away, make it tax efficient, right? With the use of potentially a family investment company, right? Trust should be an option that should be explored. Whilst it's not really sensible to put a direct property, or feasible if you have multiple properties because you're limited to buy £225,000, right? But you could potentially place shares into a trust, which are shares of an investment company, which was actually mentioned in an earlier question. So again, there's multiple ways you can do estate planning, right? So yeah, absolutely, we do this for portfolio landlords.
So I think we've covered most of the questions. As Bill did mention, yes, unfortunately, it is taking about 19 weeks. However, I can give your friends a little bit of, hopefully, a glimmer of hope in saying that if they're lucky and their probate application lands on the right person's desk, they could get probate sooner than that. I've had quite a few applications that are turned around really, really quickly. So as long as you've submitted it and everything's been approved by HMRC beforehand, then you're good to go. It's just a matter of waiting, but hopefully it won't take that long.
We have a question from Onkar. If you want to sell a rental property but have moved abroad and now non-resident landlord, are you liable for capital gains? Tax question. But again, if it's a UK, as we said, right, because HMRC can touch and feel it, they will tax it. So they will tax UK citrus assets. Yeah. So yes.
And I believe the rules changed in 2015. I think it was for all non-doms and non-residents. Yeah, anyway,
it's very complex.
It's a catch-all at the moment. Everyone pays tax.
Correct. And the worst thing about capital gains tax on residential property is that you have to pay within 60 days. So
that's correct. You have to report it.
Next. Bill again. Do you recommend recording and maintaining a detailed register of assets held?
Bill, that would be amazing. And I think if everyone did that, then their estates wouldn't be as complicated. And obviously you wouldn't have to spend as much money on a solicitor. So please get yourself organized, keep a spreadsheet, keep the information. If you have already drafted a will, then you might want to entrust that information to your trustees, executors or trustees. If you haven't already prepared a will, then by all means get in touch with us and we'll do that for you. And often solicitors can keep that information on their records as well. So it's always helpful to keep everything in-house so that when the time comes, your executors can approach your professional advisors and everything is obviously in one place.
And also just know, Bill, that, by working with an advisor, right, the first question they'll usually ask you is, what are all of your assets? So if you work with somebody on a continuous basis, they'll probably know what assets you have. So you'll have a very detailed register of the assets, right?
Exactly. And it's worth it in the long run because it could save you tax, it could save you the stress. Just, it's very advisable. And I think a lot of people should be proactive in the same way.
Absolutely. More, you bit of work now, but saves you all the trouble.
It really does. Likewise, wills, people don't necessarily want to pay a few £100s that might actually save them thousands of pounds.
Yeah.
So please just invest in your hard-earned money and the hard work that you've put forward.
The thing about wills is also that some people make a will, very normal standard will, right? And a few years later the circumstances change and they go for another will, right? But and then a few years later they change again. So over the span of 10 years, you might have paid for 5 different wills.
Yeah. Whereas
again, with the types of wills that, for example, have a trust in place, have a letter of wishes in place, right? It might be a bigger cost up front, But instead of changing the will, you can just change the letter of wishes when anything changes.
Exactly.
Right? So you future-proofed your will. So that's, again, also just to show how by investing a bit more upfront, you are saving yourself the hassle, the trouble, and the money later down the line as well.
Yeah.
So, great. So the question, thank you, Bill. Well, we look forward to listening, hearing from you. Mentioned family investment company, full portfolio landlords. Problem is that many mortgage lenders will lend to family investment companies due to multiple shareholding. Yeah, exactly. So again, as mentioned earlier, right, it's not just an issue about taxation and structuring. It's also about, sourcing the right providers, right? Sourcing the lenders, sourcing people. So, and again, we're able to help. So if you are, feel free to get in touch with us and see how we're able to help you in this regard. Neil, hi, can your firm handle expats living in the US in terms of asset protection, planning, and taxation? Actually, we do have a very, very smart advisor, Henry. He's a UK qualified tax advisor. So yeah, please get in touch and we'll put you in, we'll connect you with him. So yeah, I think, if there's any more questions, we'll wait just for about a minute, but thank you all so much for joining us at the webinar. I hope we've covered a very complex topic in, within sort of 30 or 40 minutes. Some very interesting questions, very good questions, right? And I hope we've answered as much as we can for you. Now, as it is with everything about law, trusts, right?
Tax.
The answer is it depends. So for any sort of again, if you want to explore your own circumstances, right, please do get in touch, right? So yeah, I hope you found this very helpful and insightful. And any questions you have, you can see our details here. I can be, you can either email myself, chenji@fusionfinancial.co.uk, or netsai@netsai@fusionlaw.co.uk. So again, thank you all very much, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.
Oh, Leslie, yes, our consultations, we can both be in person or video. So